Of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Orion is now less than 4,000 miles away from the lunar surface, 3,780 miles to be exact. And Orion is traveling at 4,115 miles per hour. Everything's still continuing to look good here in Mission Control Houston as we anticipate the return power flyby burn occurring at 10:43 a.m. Central, an hour and 41 minutes from now. Today's return power flyby will send Orion close enough to the lunar surface to leverage the moon's gravitational force and swing the spacecraft into a trajectory to return back to Earth. During Orion's mission, it surpassed the furthest distance for a human-rated spacecraft meant to return home at over 268,000 miles from Earth at its furthest point. Prior to the distant retrograde departure burn, Orion was in deep space in a distant retrograde orbit. This orbit is called distant due to its high altitude from the moon. It's about 40,000 miles past the moon in its orbit. This orbit is 30,000 miles further than the previous record set during Apollo 13, and again is the furthest in space any spacecraft built for humans has ever flown. The orbit is also called retrograde because Orion traveled around the moon opposite the direction the moon travels around Earth. Distant retrograde orbit provides a highly stable orbit where little fuel is required to stay for an extended trip in deep space in order to put Orion's systems to the test in an environment far from Earth. The orbit that Orion completed in this mission is different from the orbit done during the Apollo program, in which the spacecraft orbited much closer to the lunar surface in a more circular fashion. It's important for us to learn about how a spacecraft functions in a deep space environment because as part of the Artemis program, the Gateway program is building a small human-tended space station orbiting the moon that will provide extensive capabilities to support NASA's Artemis campaign. Gateway will be built with international and commercial partnerships and will support sustained exploration and research in deep space, and will include docking ports for a variety of visiting spacecraft. as well as space for crew to live and work, and onboard science investigations to study heliophysics, human health, and life sciences, among other areas. Gateway will be humanity's first space station in lunar orbit to support NASA's deep space exploration plans. But before we get to that point, we are testing out the Orion spacecraft as part of the Artemis 1 mission. Again, we're 20 days into a 25-and-a-half-day mission. And today's return-powered flyby is the next major milestone in Orion's 25-and-a-half-day mission. This burn will slingshot Orion around the moon and place it on a trajectory to splash down in the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. We're now 1 hour and 35 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. Orion is currently traveling at 4,157 miles per hour and is 3,529 miles away from the moon. Just prior to today's return power flyby burn, Orion will complete its closest approach to the moon. At closest approach, Orion will be 79 miles above the lunar surface. This closest approach, as well as the burn, will occur in our anticipated loss of signal period. That loss of signal slated to begin an hour and 32 minutes from now and will last 30 minutes long. The reason we will not have signal with the Orion spacecraft is because the moon is blocking the connection to the Deep Space Network during that time period. Again, today's LOS will be a 30-minute long loss of signal, but we are anticipating to regain communications with the Orion spacecraft once it comes around to the other side of the moon and is able to regain communications with the Deep Space Network. At that point, flight controllers here in Mission Control Houston will be able to analyze today's 3-minute and 27-second return power flyby and make sure everything performed as expected. If you're just joining us this morning, we are bringing you live coverage of today's return power flyby of the Orion spacecraft, an uncrewed test flight as part of the Artemis program. Today is flight day 20 for Orion, and there are about 5.5 days left in this test flight mission. Leading up to this event today, the return-powered flyby, there have been several other key milestones that Orion has reached, so let's take a look back at the past 20 days. First up, we have the Space Launch System launching from Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida with its sights set on the moon. SLS blasted off at 12:47 a.m. Central on November 16th. And here you see those 4 RS-25 engines lighting up the Florida sky. You can also see the orange core stage as well as one of the 2 solid rocket boosters in this view. On the very top of the vehicle is the launch abort system and, of course, the Orion spacecraft, which is now closing in on the moon ahead of today's return-powered flyby burn. Now, in this video, you have a launch from the perspective of a camera located on the Space Launch System rocket. This video shows SLS and Orion's climb to orbit. It was about an 8.5-minute climb to orbit. You can see the rocket soaring over the launch pad. Following liftoff and the climb to orbit, the translunar injection burn took place. The translunar injection maneuver took place as the upper part of the rocket, officially named the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, fired one RL-10 engine, producing 24,750 pounds of thrust to accelerate the vehicle to more than 22,600 miles per hour, which is a velocity fast enough to overcome the pull of Earth's gravity and propel Orion out of low Earth orbit to send the spacecraft to the moon. The translunar injection maneuver precisely targeted a point on the moon that helped guide Orion close enough to be captured by the moon's gravity. And right after the TLI burn, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage separated from the Orion spacecraft, which you did see in this video here. You see it floating away in the distance. Later that day, we received our first imagery of Earth, as well as completed the first checkout of the orbital maneuvering system, or OMS engine, which all went smoothly. Orion was officially on the way to the moon. And then several days later, on November 21st, Orion performed the outbound powered flyby, also with the orbital maneuvering engine, rather. The outbound powered flyby is the sister to the return powered flyby, which will occur today. The outbound powered flyby, as the name suggests, takes place on the outbound portion of the trip, whereas the return powered flyby takes place on the return journey as Orion is anticipating its return home. In this video here, you can see the Orion spacecraft, as well as the Earth in the distance and the moon off to the left. This was just before Orion flew behind the moon as part of that outbound powered flyby. After this, Orion was placed in a deep space trajectory where it completed a distant retrograde orbit. During that time frame, Orion traveled the furthest distance than any human-rated spacecraft meant to return back to Earth had ever traveled. And in this photo here, you see Orion take a photo of planet Earth from over 268,000 miles away. And in this photo here, you can see Orion's solar rays split the difference between Earth and the moon on flight day 14 of the Artemis 1 mission. This imagery was captured by one of the cameras on the tip of one of the solar arrays, the spacecraft's 4 solar arrays. And just last week, on December 1st, the distant retrograde departure burn occurred, which placed Orion in a trajectory to exit the distant retrograde orbit and head back toward the moon ahead of the return-powered flyby, which we're looking forward today. In this view here, you can see the solar array flexing as well as an Earth in the distance there, almost in the center of your screen. So it's been a busy journey for the Orion spacecraft. Again, we're on flight day 20 of a 25-and-a-half-day test flight mission. Orion is now 3,238 miles away from the lunar surface. And we are just 1 hour and 26 minutes away from today's outbound powered flyby burn, which will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds and place Orion in a trajectory to head back home. The next major milestone that we are tracking this morning here from Mission Control Houston will take place in about an hour from now, when NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling will pull the team inside Mission Control for a go, no-go for today's burn. We're continuing to bring you live imagery of the lunar surface from the Orion spacecraft as it continues to close in. Orion is currently 3,091 miles away from the moon, traveling at a velocity of 4,238 miles per hour. If you're just joining us this morning, we are 1 hour and 18 minutes away from today's outbound powered flyby burn. This burn will be 3 minutes and 27 seconds long and will propel Orion around the moon in anticipation of a splashdown off the coast of California on December 11th. Leading the team here in Mission Control Houston during today's burn is NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling. But Judd is not the only flight director here at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, that is working the Artemis mission. So let's take a look at a few of the other flight directors.
Flight CTO and flight loop.
Buddy, comfort cooling status.
Flanico AOS, good for
Copy.
Flight controllers generally focus on systems, subsystems of the vehicle, and they're more in tune with the detailed workings of their particular system that they're responsible for. Flight directors, on the other hand, are more in tune with what is the integration between all of the subsystems. What are we all marching towards? What's our mission objective?
prop flight has the RCS holding together with the regs.
Really, your training starts when you become a flight controller. You know, you learn a lot by osmosis, and you kind of get a sense of a little bit of the job, but once you become a flight director, the amount of learning you do is exponential.
You don't become an expert, but you have to understand them at a depth where you could have the good conversation, ask the right questions to the experts who are the flight controllers. You spend a lot of time studying and then training, getting in simulations and running through all the motions and practicing the real-time situation scenarios in the training environment.
I am the ascent and entry flight director for Artemis 1. I will take responsibility of the vehicle after it launches. I'll also be the entry flight director, so once we come back to Earth, I'll have a team that will monitor and control the vehicle once it splashes down, and we hand that over to Melissa Jones, who is the NASA recovery director.
Splashdown. Touchdown verify. Copy.
I'm the lead flight director for the mission, really responsible for the overall development of the mission. We work directly with the programs. They provide us the mission priorities, and we build a timeline that's going to accomplish those mission objectives. We're responsible for building our team, getting our team trained and certified. We have a training team that helps us, but we have the overall responsibility for putting together the team that's going to execute the mission.
Confirmation of translunar injection burn cutoff.
When you go to a place like the moon or Mars, you really have to be explorers. It pushes the boundaries of civilization.
We are having to develop new technology that's going to have to sustain the astronauts for these very, very long trips. And it just makes sense to test that and go into the moon where you're in a similar environment, but you're much closer, and in the event of an emergency type scenario, we can bring them safely back home.
Station, this is Houston.
We've had a lot of experience now in low Earth orbit, you know, over 50, 60 years of experience, and we've learned how to do that pretty well. We've learned what the effects of the body are in low Earth orbit, but there's still things that we need to practice, and we need to be able to understand how you sustain life further and further and further away from our planet.
It's just so different from everything you learn when you do low Earth orbit. And that's what's making it so much fun. I'm every bit as excited about this mission as I was the first day I walked in the doors of Mission Control.
Orion continuing to close in on the moon, now 2,774 miles away, traveling at a velocity of 4,300 miles per hour. And you are looking at a view of the bottom of the European space You are looking at a view of the European service module, the very bottom of it there. And you are seeing the large engine there in the center of the European service module. That's the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, or OMS engine. That's the engine that will be utilized during today's return power flyby burn. This is the main engine on the European Service Module and is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown in space 19 times before, all on Space Shuttle flights, beginning with STS-41G in October 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October 2002. We are now 1 hour and 13 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. That burn will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds, and will change the velocity of the Orion spacecraft by 960 feet per second. You're also getting a great view of the 8 auxiliary engines on Orion. And again, Orion continues to close in on the moon, now only 2,680 miles away from the lunar surface. Following today's closest approach to the moon, Orion will be only 79.2 miles above the lunar surface. We're now 1 hour and 8 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. Everything continuing to move smoothly here in Mission Control Houston. As a reminder, we will lose signal when Orion crosses behind the moon. That's because the moon will be blocking the signal to the Deep Space Network. We are anticipating that loss of signal 1 hour and 5 minutes from now. That will be a 30-minute loss of signal. During this loss of signal period is when Orion will complete the return-powered flyby burn, that 3-minute and 27-second burn that will send Orion on a trajectory to head back home ahead of a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. And if you are just joining us this morning, we are bringing you live coverage of today's return-powered flyby burn here in Mission Control Houston. That burn is 1 hour and 6 minutes away from now and will be a 3-minute, 27-second burn that will slingshot Orion around the moon in a trajectory to head back to Earth and a splashdown on December 11th. But we have been getting some beautiful views of the moon, and I have a very special guest with me this morning. This is Juliana Gross. She's the Deputy Apollo Curator, and she's going to point out some of these amazing features that we have been seeing on the lunar surface in some of the shots that we have been getting. So thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time.
You're very welcome. I'm very excited to be here.
Yes, absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about some of the features that we are seeing on the lunar surface here?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look on the moon right now to the left middle area of the moon there, the bright spot that you see there, that's Copernicus crater. The dark region that is sort of like right in front in the middle center of the moon right now, that's the Imbrium basin. And so these are impact features that we have on the moon. So when the moon formed throughout its history, over its 4.5 billion years, has been bombarded by meteorites and asteroids. And for the Imbrium, that's the darker round area that you can see there, what happened is there's a massive crater, and so we call these a basin, and melt from the interior of the moon came up through cracks and then filled that basin crater. And you can imagine that as a big lava lake, and then it cooled to form basalt. The same thing happens at the moment on Earth. Hawaii is erupting, and that brings up basalt from the interior of Earth. So these basalt samples, when we analyze them and we look at these, we can learn something about the interior of the moon. I see that we lost our actual live view, but in this beautiful view that we can see here, you can really nicely see Copernicus. Right in the center, and that's brighter because it excavates crustal material, which is white or bright, compared to the mare, which are basalt, which is dark. Oh, there we are back. So Copernicus is now in the lower right corner of that image. That's a fairly young crater, and that's why it still appears fairly bright, because over time, when the sun interacts with lunar rocks, it darkens over time. So we call it space weathering. Yeah.
And so we are flying fairly close to some of the Apollo landing sites now. We're a little too high above. We're about 2,000 miles away from the moon still to make out any features. But can you talk about a little bit about what the Apollo program studied in those landing zones, and maybe touch on how Artemis is going to be different, because we're going to be landing in an entirely different spot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Apollo wasn't so much about science. It was more about like, hey, we're actually going to the moon and we can do it, and like the technology to show that we can do it. Apollo 14 and 12 sort of landed near Copernicus, like south of where Copernicus crater is right now that I pointed out in that region. And so Apollo 14 landed there in 1971, right above the Frau-Maurer region, which is kind of like south of Copernicus, and it's right at the edge of that big Imbrium basin that I talked about. They brought back a lot of rocks. They were interested in the rocks that were excavated from Imbrium. So there's a lot of impact melt, as we call them, or breccias. And every time a rock gets exposed to like heat and pressure and started to remelt in like an impact event like that, it resets the internal clock. So when rocks form, they record the condition from which they formed, including the age, like the time when they formed. But every time there's an impact event and it gets remelted, that internal clock resets. Now we can take these rocks and then measure the ages of them. And so every time the clock got reset, we now have the age of that impact event. And so we want to know when Imbrium formed, because it's such a big event that happened on the moon, that we can put everything else in relative age to each other. So that why that mission was important. Apollo 12 landed in the Oceanus Procellarum region, which is sort of to the lower left and then going up. It's kind of like where that shaded, like where you kind of stop seeing the moon, you know, the boundary of the shade and the sunlight lit area. The little bright spot that comes up on the, what is that, lower left third of the moon, that is Aristarchus crater. So it's a super bright crater in that Procellarum region, which we're now seeing more and more of. So that's sort of the area where Apollo 12 landed. That landing was to sort of show that we can do a pinpoint landing. So they landed 200 meters away from the Surveyor 3 lander, and they actually brought a piece from Surveyor 3 back to Earth to like really show. And that then paved the way for future missions to like really like, hey, we can do a pinpoint landing. So we can go to like a more difficult terrain where we can land, where it's more ruggedy. And so that's where we went there. And so now you can see even more of the Procellarum region. Most of that is dark gray, as you can see, and so these are the basalts, and that mission brought back a lot of these basaltic materials. And then we can look at the ages, and it turns out that those basalts were very different, and they were younger than the Apollo 11 mission, than the rocks that they brought back, the basalts that they brought back. Now, Artemis is going to be super exciting because we're going to a very different region. So if you look at the surface here, and you can see that's mostly dark gray, so it's mostly basalts. You can see in the upper part of the moon that's still bright. That's what we call the highland crust. So that's the very old crust. So when the moon formed, there was a giant impact between two protoplanets. It collided, created a lot of heat, everything melted. The center part formed and became Earth. And then the debris cloud that surrounded it coalesced and then became the moon. So once upon a time, the moon was covered in a global magma ocean. So it was fully molten, right? And if you have a global magma ocean, you start crystallizing things. So now when you crystallize stuff that is denser than the melt, that sinks, right? And if you crystallize things that are less dense than the melt, that starts to float, like ice is floating on water, right? And so now we have these crystals crystallizing these minerals, and they are less dense, so they float to the surface and they build the crust. These crystals are called plagioclase. They're white. And so your crust that then forms on the moon is white. And that's why the moon looks so bright when you look at this image or in the night sky, because that's the old crust of, you know, the oldest rocks we have, and they're white in color, and so that's why this is so bright. Now the near side, so the side that we see right now, we see these dark patches, which then are the younger basalts that came to the surface once you start impacting it, and you take stuff away, you made these big basins, and then the interior remelts, and that melt comes up to form to fill these craters. That's very special. So it turns out that this Procalarium region, where Imbrium sits in, where Apollo 12 landed, where Apollo 14 landed, all these rocks that were brought back, they have a weird component that we call creep. And it's spelled K-R-E-E-P, and it stands for potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphor. That entire Mars regions that you can see here also has iron in it, lots of iron and lots of titanium, but the rest of the moon doesn't really have that. And so geologically speaking, all the Apollo rocks are really, really cool because they're very special, right? So if I would give you 6 missions and you land them on Earth and you land them all in Yellowstone National Park, and you collect all your rocks, right? You get, geologically speaking, really interesting rocks, but they're not representative for the United States or the rest of the world, right? So same happens with Apollo. Really cool rocks, geologically speaking, very interesting, lots of basalts, right? They all have this weird creep component, so they're all creepy. But the rest of the moon is very different, so they're not representative. Now with Artemis, we're going to go to the South Polar region. So that region is more representative compared to Apollo. We don't really expect a lot of basalts there, so that's more like highland region. The South Polar region also has the largest impact basin that we have on the moon, and also the oldest. So if we can bring back rocks from there, we can hopefully date that really, really old impact region, and then get a better idea of when things happened on the moon and establish a timeline. Now we also know that the polar regions are really, really cold. And so ices or volatiles and gases on the moon, they freeze out in the polar region. So when we go there and collect rocks, we can also bring back these frozen samples and then learn something about where the water is coming from, whether it's moon or, there was lots of asteroids and comets that impacted the moon. And then so we can also learn about something about the water that was delivered to the Earth-Moon system, which most likely also ended up on Earth. And so we can learn something about our own history and how the moon formed and evolved over time better than we can with Apollo. We're missing a lot of rocks and processes with Apollo, and hopefully we can fill these gaps with Artemis.
You are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information. Now, as we continue to get closer and closer to the lunar surface, of course, these features are going to become more and more clear. Orion is now 2,000 miles away from the moon, but at closest approach today, it will be just about 80 miles above the lunar surface. So before you go for the day, it looks like we are starting to get some better views of that area that you were discussing before. Is there any other items or areas that have come into view since we've been chit-chatting that you think would be helpful to point out?
Yeah, so we see Kepler crater, which is sort of to the left and lower left of Copernicus, what I just pointed out. So it's this like grayish area with the little dot in the center. And then if you go from there further to the left, right at where the moon's shades are, so there's still a little lower left, that really bright area, that's Aristarchus crater. And that's a really young crater, and it's really bright because it brought up material from that crust that I saw, and that's this white rock. It turns out we have orbital reflectance data. So when we look at the light, the sunlight that gets reflected off the surface, we can make assumptions about the chemistry in that region. And it turns out that that region is, geologically speaking, really, really complicated. So it brought back up old crustal material, but we also see some basaltic material. And in the central peak, we see material that is silicic, so it's really, really high in silica. And that usually means there's some kind of evolved rock. And when we say evolved, on Earth, that usually means like granites and stuff like that. We don't really mean it that way here, but it has more silica content in it. When I say central peak, so what happens when you have a big impact into the crust rebounds and brings a central part comes up. If you think about it, throwing a rock into water, right, it makes a splash, and then the water rebounds and brings a kind of like a central thing up and then plops back down. So if you would freeze that water, it would stand up in the center. So that happens on the moon or on Earth as well, where like the crust rebounds. And so the central peak is the area that is the deepest material that got brought back to the surface. So that is of importance and special interest to scientists, because now we have another window into the interior of the moon to study these things. And it turns out, specifically for that little bright crater there, it's super complicated, and then we're still trying to figure out what we are seeing.
So it sounds like there's definitely much to be learned from the moon, especially through the Artemis program, and I'm sure you're looking forward to getting some of those samples back to be able to study in depth.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Juliana, for taking time out of your day to chat with us. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is fantastic.
We're now 50 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby burn. This burn will slingshot Orion around the lunar surface and put it in a trajectory ahead of a splashdown on December 11th back on Earth. This burn will be a 3-minute and 27-second long burn and will be the longest burn of the mission utilizing the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. You are getting a view of the OMS engine on your screen. It's in the very top left, the largest engine on your screen. The next major milestone that we're tracking here in Mission Control Houston is the Go, No-Go poll. During this poll, NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling will go around the room and poll each of the flight console positions to ensure that all is looking good ahead of today's burn. Orion is now less than 2,000 miles away from the moon, 1,756 miles, moving at a velocity of 4,563 miles per hour. At this time, Orion is over 237,000 miles away from Earth. And if you're just joining us, Orion is now 1,550 miles away from the moon. We are anticipating today's return-powered flyby burn to begin 43 minutes from now. This burn will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. During the time period that the burn takes place, Orion will be in a loss of signal period because it will be directly behind the moon, and the moon will be blocking the signal with the deep space network. Today's loss of signal will last for 30 minutes. After we come back around to the other side of the moon, we anticipate regaining communications with the Orion spacecraft, and that's when the team here in Mission Control will be able to analyze the return-powered flyby burn and make sure everything went as expected. This burn is critical as we look ahead to a return and splashdown of the Orion spacecraft on December 11th. Today's burn will put us in a trajectory to enable that splashdown. And on your screen right now, you are seeing some movement here. This is taking place as the solar array wings get into the right configuration ahead of today's burn. A great view of the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, or OMS engine, coming into view on the European Service Module. That's that large engine on the very bottom of the European Service Module, and is the engine that will be used during today's 3 minute and 27-second burn. Again, this will be the longest burn done by the OMS engine so far, but the OMS engine can actually fire for up to 16 minutes if necessary. You're also getting a view of the 8 auxiliary engines on Orion. These engines can fire for less than 1 minute, up to 45 minutes in length. And these engines are used more for trajectory corrections. Each engine provides about 100 pounds of thrust and can provide steering during burns by pulsing on and off. Orion continuing to get in the proper orientation ahead of today's burn. We are tracking that burn 38 minutes from now. And again, during that burn, we will lose signal with the Orion spacecraft. The loss of signal will be 36 minutes from now. You're looking at a view from our data-driven animation of the Orion spacecraft. As you can see, we're now 1,317 miles away from the moon, Orion moving at over 4,700 miles per hour. At this time, Orion is over 238,000 miles away from Earth. Everything continuing to move smoothly this morning as we anticipate the return powered flyby burn 36 minutes from now. We are hearing that the Orion spacecraft is now in the proper attitude ahead of today's burn. From this view, you can see that orbital maneuvering system engine on the left of your screen, that large engine on the European service module. That's the engine that will be utilized during today's burn. You also see two of the auxiliary engines, as well as two of the solar arrays. On the tip of the solar arrays, on the wings of the solar arrays, are the SAW, or solar array wing cameras. Those are the cameras which are capturing the imagery that you see right now on your screen. Orion continuing to close in on the moon, now 1,100 miles above the surface of the moon. During today's closest approach, Orion will be just 80 miles above the surface of the moon. Here in just a couple of minutes, we do expect NASA Flight Director Judd Freeling to give a go, no-go poll for today's return-powered flyby burn. If the team polls go, then we are anticipating the burn to begin at 10:43 a.m. Central and last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. This burn will slingshot us around the moon and get Orion into a trajectory to return back to Earth and splash down off the coast of California. While Orion is behind the moon today, we will not have communication with the vehicle because the moon will be blocking the connection to the deep space network. However, once Orion swings back around on the other side of the moon and regains communications with the deep space network, we do anticipate to be able to communicate with the vehicle. Today's loss of signal is slated to last 30 minutes. And at this time period, we are now 1 hour away from We are now 29 minutes away from the loss of signal and about an hour away from the acquisition of signal. If you're just joining us this morning, we are bringing you live coverage of today's return-powered flyby of the Orion spacecraft, which is now 20 days into its 25-and-a-half-day test flight. While this Orion spacecraft is uncrewed as part of Artemis 2, we will have crew on board Artemis 2. Today's return-powered flyby will begin at 10:43 a.m. Central and will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. This burn will slingshot Orion around the backside of the moon and put it in a trajectory ahead of a splashdown off the coast of California just a few days from now on December 11th. During Orion's mission, it broke the record for longest distance traveled away from Earth for a human-rated spacecraft meant to return back to Earth. On November 28th, Orion broke that record, having traveled 268,563 miles away from our home planet. During this time period, Orion was in the distant retrograde orbit. Orion remained in this distant retrograde orbit for about 6 days, in which we tested out the systems of the spacecraft in the deep space environment. Last week, the distant retrograde departure burn took place, which brought Orion back towards the moon, which we are now less than 1,000 miles away from. The DRD burn set us up for today's return-powered flyby burn. And this burn again sets us up for splashdown just a few days from now. And here is the view of the moon, as mentioned, less than 1,000 miles away. Still a little ways to go to get to our closest approach of the day, at which point Orion will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. But we are getting closer to today's anticipated burn, now 27 minutes away from that burn, and just 24 minutes away from the anticipated loss of signal. Orion continuing to pick up speed as it closes in on the lunar surface, now traveling at 4,852 miles per hour, and now just 846 miles away from the moon. We're continuing to get a shot of the Orion spacecraft, namely the European Service Module and the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, on the left hand of your screen there, the largest engine shown. That's actually the largest engine on the Orion spacecraft. The OMS engine is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown on 19 Space Shuttle flights. The first flight was STS-41G in October 1984, and the last was STS-112 in October 2002. And the go, no-go poll for the return-powered flyby is now underway. And the team here in Mission Control Houston did poll go for today's return-powered flyby burn. That burn will take place 23 minutes from now. And with the go from the team here in Mission Control Houston for the return powered flyby burn, we're now just counting down the minutes until the start of that burn. Again, 22 minutes away from today's burn. This burn will last 3 minutes and 27 seconds. But just prior to the burn, we will lose signal with the Orion spacecraft. That loss of signal is anticipated in 19 minutes from now. The reason we do lose communication with the spacecraft is because it will be flying directly behind the moon, and the moon is blocking the signal to the Deep Space Network. However, once the spacecraft travels back to the other side of the moon, we do expect to regain communications with the vehicle at that time. Orion is now only 687 miles away from the moon. At closest approach today, Orion will be just 80 miles above the lunar surface. Now just 20 minutes away from today's return-powered flyby. This burn will commit Orion to a trajectory to head back to planet Earth after its 20-day mission so far. By the time Orion splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, it will have been in space for 25 and a half days.